Okay, hi everyone. This is Rachel Norton speaking from ISET, and as Michael said, Kamini is here with me as well. Michael, if you could go to the next slide. So these, Michael spoke to you earlier. Karen will be another presenter. She'll be leading webinar 3 next week, and she is from ISET as well. So a little bit for today, our agenda is to discuss how to become a forensic researcher, to just talk about disaster forensics and to talk about how to ask open-ended and learning-oriented questions. We'll review some frameworks that help support systems thinking. We'll delve into the report structure, which is outlined in the Perc manual, which hopefully most of you have seen. And then we'll talk about applying the Perc sequence, how you do a Perc and what to do when, and how you can develop desktop review and key research themes, and how to bring out key insights and recommendations after you have all of this information. How do you use it to inform recommendations? And then we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A, both about today and Monday's webinar, as well as your homework for webinar 3. So you can go to the next one, Michael. And then again, webinar 3, we'll be talking about this next Wednesday, bringing all the pieces together from what you've learned in the past 2 webinars. We'll look at, again, the Perc manual. We'll have you present your mini case study, so your mini Perc, and we'll just highlight again the key ingredients to what makes up a successful Perc. Okay, next slide, please. So we've seen this from webinar 1 as well, but just so we're reminded about what the goal is for these webinars. The goal is to have you all be familiar with the Perc methodology, why we're doing a Perc, and the steps to becoming trained in this methodology. You'll learn how to use the Perc manual to help you do a Perc, and if you have any questions while you're doing a Perc, where you can go in the manual to look for answers. We'll understand the key differentiators of the Perc, so what makes a Perc different from other types of post-disaster studies. We'll talk about the methods again and applying the Perc sequence, how to become a forensic researcher, again, thinking about those open-ended, learning-oriented questions, and then the goals are to identify key challenges and key opportunities with the Perc, and how to find those kind of gold nuggets and key learning points throughout the process. Next slide. So what is disaster forensics? So the field of disaster forensics emerged to fill the gap in learning kind of between global and specific levels. It borrows the term forensics from the field of criminal investigation, as we all probably know, because it denotes a consistent approach to developing a full analysis of an event and its root causes. And it really enables a systematic approach, and it's open to new insights. For example, the buildup of risk in an area, and encourages a diligent but also flexible analysis. And in this way, a Perc review, which is a type of forensic analysis, helps to identify and contextualize the most important aspects of risks and the resulting events, while at the same time providing a consistent approach, which facilitates cross-situational learning. Next slide. Thank you. So a key part of disaster forensics and being a forensics researcher is really using systems thinking. And this approach is important because disasters are cross-cutting So they're multi-sectoral, they affect multiple systems, and how people are impacted depends on their access to all of these, to how all of these different things are categorized or simplified by, for example, the 5 capitals framework, which Michael talked about on Monday. And so these are kind of the 4 frameworks that we use to explore and look at or utilize as forensic researchers when we're looking at disasters or post-events, doing these post-event reviews. So we have the 5 capitals again and the 4 R's in the bottom right corner there that Michael talked about on Monday. And then the DRM cycle, which we have in the center here. So, you know, preparedness, response, recovery, and risk reduction also helps to think about where all of the pieces fall as you're thinking across these sectors and across these capitals. And then the top there, systems, agents, and institutions is also just another framework that we'll dig into a little bit more later in the presentation that can really just guide an analysis of an event in thinking about how all of these systems interact.
And just to add add to what Rachel is saying, I mean, the PERC is broadly the PERC is broadly organized into. Oh, Michael is the. Sorry. Anyway, so the PERC is broadly organized by the DRM cycle. So the entirety of the DRM cycle kind of represents the scope of the research that you're doing. So we call it a bird's eye view of what's going on at large within disaster risk management, because you're looking at the pre-event landscape, you're looking at, so that's going to be your disaster risk reduction, your preparedness pieces, you're looking at what happened during the disaster, so that is more of your response and your early recovery, and then you're kind of exploring what might happen in the post-disaster landscape, which is your kind of long-term recovery piece, and then you're deriving learning from that. And where the 5 capitals framework really, really helps is in kind of telling you what the systems that you're looking across are going to be, because you have elements of natural capital, social capital, financial capital, and so on that cross-cut across the entirety of the DRM cycle. And then where you have that agents, institutions, and systems, it really kind of helps you when it comes to the analysis phase of kind of deconstructing what it is that you've learned. And we will go into that more later.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So just so you know who's talking, some photos of us to put faces to names and to voices. Next slide, please. Okay. So, you know, we just reviewed how we draw on systems thinking and learning around disasters for these perks. So in the next several slides, we're really going to delve into what a perk looks like. And we have here a report structure, and this can be an output from this process, but the end goal is really to develop perk learning that can be packaged in multiple ways. So again, as a part of that, we've done reports that are kind of repositories of the whole body of information that we collect throughout this process. But it can also provide backup evidence for some shorter pieces. So what we do with the information is flexible in that regard. And if you have the manual with you, the sections of the PERC report are listed on pages 11 through 13 in the PERC manual. And again, we'll dive into each of these sections briefly in the next couple slides. But the main idea here is to look at the conditions pre-event, during the event, and post-event. So here, pre-event is really focusing on vulnerability, so the physical and social context. And as a reminder here, we're to note that exposure is different from social vulnerability. So there's a lot of characteristics of vulnerability when we say vulnerability. Pre-event, you're also looking at prospective and corrective risk reduction and preparedness. During the event, you're looking at what happened during the response and early recovery. And this is key to note that early recovery is distinct from long-term recovery. I mean, they kind of flow into each other, but this is why historical perspectives on disasters are important, because longer-term recovery can give a sense of the types of recovery issues that have cropped up over time. Some would argue, for example, that Hurricane Katrina, people are still in the recovery process from that. So long-term recovery can go for years and decades. And that's really in the post-event part of this, where you're focusing on the longer-term recovery and resilience building. And here is where the recommendations and lessons learned can inform resilience building and recovery so that we're not building back to the status quo. Next slide. So these sections are all, again, in the Perc manual. So I'm not going to go into every single bullet point, but the key here is to think about the body of evidence that we're going to have after we go through this process and where it all fits in. So again, sections 1 and 2, as you can see here, so the physical context and the socioeconomic disaster landscape are really kind of where that pre-event focus falls. So again, you're looking at exposure as well as vulnerability, thinking about disaster risk reduction, and preparedness as well, so what people did to prepare. And then you could go to the next slide. So section 3 is really where you start to transition into what happened during the event. And again, this includes response. You're looking at the impact. You're looking at what happened during early recovery. And you're beginning to have and integrating kind of those ongoing looks at long-term recovery. And again, this is where we're noting that early recovery and long-term recovery are very different. And you're also looking at the different types of impacts that happened. So this could be livelihood impacts, direct impacts to structures, for example. So it's also a reminder to kind of look holistically at all of the different types of things that happened during the event. Next slide, please. So these next few sections are really where the analysis happens. So this is where we have the lessons learned and the key insights. And this is where in the report, we would generally try to reflect the broader patterns that we've seen regarding the successes that happened and the failures as well. So what are the lessons that we learned from the event? And these recommendations that you're developing should largely reflect what can be tangibly addressed as well. So they are broader scale recommendations, which we'll delve into a little bit later, but they should, be tangible recommendations so that people can actually do something with them. Let's see. And again, this is really where the data analysis is happening. So you're really bringing those key insights or highlighting the key insights here. And you can broadly organize these key insights around the DRM cycle, but it's important to note that there may be elements that you find that are cross-cutting across the DRM cycle. And as well, you're building the recommendations off of the key insights. So the recommendations shouldn't, or we try not to have them be so they're just in a silo. They should be linked to the key insights, which are linked to all of the information that you gathered and the analysis that you did. So really, it should all be kind of flowing from the beginning, from the information through the data analysis all the way to your recommendations.
And just note that, I mean, this table, this report structure is actually really, really useful as you pursue your first couple of perks, because it once again gives you kind of the scope of what you're looking at. It's organized into a set of questions, which we haven't delved into too deeply today, but it is really worth familiarizing yourself with and helping you organize your perk analysis and writing. So, yeah, just wanted to note that.
Great, thank you. Okay, now that we have, delved into a little bit about the disaster forensics approach and talked about systems thinking and done a quick overview of the report structure, we're just curious, has anybody done this type of kind of event review before or analysis? So feel free to unmute yourself or fill in the chat to answer this question. We're just curious if people can relate any types of experiences where they've done something similar to this. Okay,
or even a broader risk assessment or a synthesis report where you're bringing together a lot of different aspects of the field together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be great to get a sense of who's done what.
So Stephen Tyler says he has. Stephen, would you mind sharing a little bit about one of these types of analyses that you've done? Oh, Stephen's looking for the unmute. 1 second.
Okay, hello everybody. I should introduce myself. I'm joining the webinar today as an associate with ISET. So I have not been involved in a specific PERC study with Zurich as part of the Resilience Alliance, but I did some of the earlier work for ISET to develop the concepts and tools. So I have been involved in some flood assessments, particularly in cities in Vietnam.
Great. And Stephen will probably, again, I'm sorry, Stephen, I meant to introduce you earlier. As he said, he may be chiming in because of his past experience with this type of stuff as well. Has anybody else done any similar, had a similar experience doing this type of review or analysis or risk assessment, as Kamini said?
Hi there. My name is Susan Homan, and I'm with the DuPont Company, and just thrilled to be part of this workshop learning process. But along with my colleague, Chris Fetterman, who's also on the line, we work in our building and construction business and are involved not in a post-event review so much as a learning machine process, which got us to Zurich, quite frankly. And it's, I'd say that what's similar is just the investigation, the interview process and investigation, and the process that we're going through that's more about discovery and less, less obviously less comprehensive than a post-event review. But as it pertains to resiliency, we're very interested on, gathering the facts and what we'd call the discovery phase prior to really applying some innovative strategies for our business. So I just thought I would share that. It's a Learning Machine is just an outside consultant process that we're using, but you know, relies very heavily. It's thought of as, you know, the process is like, you know, you can sum it up in 100 interviews in 100 days. You know, a sprint for discovery, as opposed to you know, in the field of innovation. So just thought I would share that and also introduce myself as being on the call.
Great, Susan, thank you so much. And I think as we are delving into, you know, more in the methodology, we'd be curious to hear, you know, as we're talking about kind of the type of interviews that we do, if you have done something similar and how, you know, that could help to inform the process for this as well. So it'd be great when we get to that part for you to just, if there are similarities or lessons learned for you to share as well. That'd be great.
Sure. Would happy to do that.
Thank you. Anybody else? Hey, not seeing any other hands raised, so we can move into the PERC sequence. Michael, if you could advance the slide. Thank you. So now that we know a little bit more kind of about the end goal, whether it's the report or any other type of PERC learning, we are going to go into more details on the process and methodology, and we'll detail the data we need to arrive at this end goal, so at this PERC learning. And the PERC sequence here, we have 9 steps outlined on this slide, but we're going to dig a little more into each of these in the following slides. But really, these steps, as we're looking at them, can fit into 4 broad categories. So defining the study, which involves conducting background research, developing key research areas and research questions, and starting to identify key stakeholders and interviewees. And then the second category would thanks. I just heard myself echoing for a second. So the second category, excuse me, sorry, would be to conduct the study. So you visit the affected areas, you conduct some interviews, while at the same time continuing data review and literature review, and you'll start the analysis. And then once you have all of that information from all the interviews and all the desk research, you'll move into the analysis phase. So deconstructing what happened, you'll look again at all of the different pieces, so systems, agents, and institutions, and you'll piece it all together, looking for points of failure that might occur within the interactions. And you can look at single points of failure, or there may be cascading points of failure. And also here you'll be looking for those successes as well. And then the last piece of this is you'll package it and disseminate it. Again, it can be in the report form or in another format as well. Okay, next slide. So the first step here is to identify the event and to think about why it's worth studying and if there are any leads as to what made it turn into a disaster. So again, we're thinking about how a hazard turns into a disaster here. And most, if not all, of the past PERCs that have been conducted have included some new element of learning. I say this, but this doesn't necessarily mean that something new came out of it. For example, it could be something that people know happens all the time, but it could be understudied. One example is that flooding happens fairly often in Charleston, so much so that residents have become used to it. But there's always something to be learned from this kind of daily experience where people have just become accustomed to flooding. Another example of kind of new elements of learning that could come out of a Perc are new and novel ways that people are adapting to living with water. And also, we wanted to note that you don't necessarily have to look at disasters that have the biggest losses. You can study disasters at different scales because those are going to potentially turn up these kind of new elements of learning. So looking at the list here, kind of what came out of these different Percs that included a new element. So for the Central European flood in 2013, it examined what had been learned since flooding in 2002 and looked at, what a flood might look like in 2023. For UK in 2013, it examined how flood defenses proved to be worth their investment. The Nopal 2014 floods, this was new because it happened in a rural development context, and other Percs hadn't really focused on that before. For the Balkans in 2014, floods occurred in a former war zone. Switzerland 2014, the flood alert occurred on a hot, sunny day, so you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about floods. South Carolina, a hurricane turned into an inland flood event. And then you have southern Germany, looking at flash floods. Houston, Hurricane Harvey flooded a major metropolis. And then in Peru, it was a coastal El Nino flood. So all of these listed here are floods. The focus is floods, but they all had a slightly different focus that included some sort of new element of learning. Next slide. So after you've kind of identified the event, you start digging into it. And this involves extensive desk research using third-party sources to get oriented about what happened and to start digging into understanding the context of the disaster. And this can include using news articles, reports, maybe there was some quick turnaround academic papers or white papers that came out about the disaster. But the idea is to use all of the desk research and all this information that you're finding to begin to think about some threads that you're seeing or to identify some threads that can turn into key research themes. However, this is important. The desk research is important for understanding what happened in the context, but it's really important to know that what we're reading in the news may change what we end up hearing on the ground when we go into the field for interviews. So what we have on this slide, these are just some of the articles that we found based on our desk research for Hurricane Florence. And these are the beginnings of some of the threads that we may be following as we go into the field. But again, these threads may or may not be what we end up studying at the end of all of it. If you could go to the next slide. So again, this is using the desktop review and all this information to start to develop key research themes.
Sorry to interrupt briefly. Yep. There's quite a bit of background noise. If people could mute themselves, also those who have just recently dialed in. We want to leave lines open from our end so people can ask questions. If that doesn't work, then I will have to mute all lines centrally. Thanks for that. Go on, please.
Thanks, Michael. So again, just what we have here is some examples of what we have found to date for Hurricane Florence. A few news articles about the environmental health impacts of hog waste, for example, following the floods, as well as thinking about the attribution of climate change, how that's changed from post-event or pre-event and post-event. And again, these are just kind of the beginning inklings of what we may want to focus on for the Perc, because there's been examples, Kamini, maybe you had talked about an example the other day where it ended up that what we found in the news, or what we found, but just by doing this desktop review, wasn't actually what people were experiencing on the ground.
Yeah, so, I mean, before we did our Houston Perc, I mean, a lot of the desk review suggested that the flooding was primarily because of the level of paving of surfaces that there was. So basically, water had like nowhere really to run to. But once we actually got there, what we had was a little bit of pushback against that idea, where people were saying, well, actually, the soils are pretty heavy on clay anyway, so there isn't a huge amount of water absorption by the soils anyway. So while, yes, there is an element of sprawl and building that has exacerbated flooding in the area, it's not the full story of what's happened. So that's one example of how you might go into the field with specific impressions, but when you actually talk to people and try to verify those claims, you hear slightly different stories.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So these first three steps, so the second two steps, so desk research and then developing key research themes, are also related to how you identify your initial leads and identifying interview candidates. Because if you think that you might want to, dig into the attribution of climate change or look at the environmental health impacts of the event, then that can help you to think about the type of people. So if we want to look at hog waste, for example, we might want to reach out to North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality or their public health department, or maybe academics that are focused on current hog waste practices. And the same with attribution of climate change. You can start to think about academics that this is their area of expertise, or how town officials are kind of wrestling with this topic as well. And again, this can change, but really what this desk research does is it helps to frame your initial foray into the event and it begins to provide a kind of structure for your field work.
And just to note here as well, I mean, sometimes it's really tempting to just find the academics that are experts in these areas of interest and research themes or questions that you identify. But I mean, expertise can look like a lot of different things. So what you really want is people, yes, who have that kind of academic, rich historical background and understanding of why things have happened the way they have, but you also want to balance it out with the expertise that's generated from lived experience, which is why you would want to go talk to people that work in government and deal with these issues every day, which is why you want to go talk to people that have been impacted by these issues, because their lived experience is quite different. So you really want to develop a pretty diverse set of interview candidates based on what these research questions that you have are.
Yes. And, think even people that might beyond town official, even residents, that might be dealing with environmental health impacts as well, and how they're thinking about these issues after the event. Next slide. So you've had this list of interviewees, potential interviewees, and you would then visit the affected areas and begin to set up interviews with with all of these stakeholders that you've identified. And here, again, we're using the Hurricane Florence example. From our desk research, we identified that Wilmington and New Bern were two of the hardest hit areas. So this provides kind of, again, a structure for where we're going to start to focus. But again, you could get into the field and find that the focus might be elsewhere. And also, these are, again, where it was heavily impacted, but it's important to visit the areas as well where the main decision-making might happen, even if it's not impacted. So an example here would be Raleigh. This is where most of the state officials are located. And Raleigh wasn't as impacted as Wilmington and New Bern, but we would still probably and are going to be visiting Raleigh because of this is where all those decision makers are. And in visiting the field, I'll talk a little bit more about how we scheduled the interviews and give you a few tools there. But it's also important to think about that visiting is not just about talking to people and doing the interviews. It's also about driving around to see the damage. You could more informally just chat with people to see how the event has impacted them. In Houston, for example, we stopped by a local coffee shop that hadn't really been impacted physically by Hurricane Harvey, but we just chatted with the owner there, and he was able to give us a sense of what happened in the area, and brought up the issue that even though he hadn't physically been impacted, that his customer base had been impacted, which has implications for his business, obviously. So there's more of the structured interviews that you set up, but also the more informal that can just happen as you're walking around a place. And as you're driving around, you can really get a visual of what happened and can see kind of the socioeconomic impacts of the events as well. If you go to the next slide. And so here is an example of a tool that we've used during these events. It's a weekly planner for setting up some of the interviews that I talked about. And ideally, you would try to group these interviews according to the location. So, Monday and Tuesday, you could be in Wilmington, whereas Wednesday and Thursday, you would try to group them in New Bern. The reality is that it's messy and it might not work that way, but ideally that's how you would want to do it. And so this is just a tool that we've used to help us as we've gone into the field and to try to be efficient and to maximize, our time while we're out in the field. And this is just a simple Excel sheet. There might be other tools that you all have that can help with planning as well. And this just gives you a sense of what we include in our schedule as well. So there's travel time, if it's a place farther away from your home base. There might be different types of events aside from interviews. So there might be a workshop that's happening or a talk that's happening about the floods that you might want to go to at the local library. It might just be a phone call. So we just included in here examples of all the different types of interviews that we've done and what it looks like for our time while we're out in the field.
And you probably really don't want to organize beyond 3 interviews per day per team that's on the ground. I mean, 3 interviews sure might just seem like 3 hours of talking to people, but beyond that, you're really getting pushed and you start forgetting things because it's just an incredible amount of information, because what you're doing between the interviews is that you're sitting and processing and building the narrative of what's happened, trying to figure out where you're seeing gaps, where you need more information. So it is, your days are far more involved than just going out and conducting these interviews. So, yeah, I would recommend that you don't do over 3 interviews a day as one team. If you have 2 teams, sure, that might be 6 interviews that you're dividing and conquering. But yeah.
Thanks. And also, this is what it looks like. I pulled this from our experience in Houston doing the Hurricane Harvey Perc. But what this is going to look like is really going to depend on the context as well. If doing these types of, doing the Perc in Peru, for example, Kamini, maybe you can speak to this as well, is probably did not look the same as doing the interviews and the field work in Houston, just because the contexts are totally different as well.
Yeah, we had to organize the schedules very differently. In Nopal, when we did it, because we had to stay about 2 hours away from the field sites of where we were doing the interviews, there was just an incredible amount of travel time to build in. And the interviews looked very different because we had translators. So it's very different from conducting an interview in your own language. So, yeah, the way we conducted those interviews is quite different. And then often in Nopal and in Peru and stuff, there are more kind of like formal events that you end up showing up to, like conferences and workshops and things, just to kind of make yourself known, and hope that people will talk to you. So that they can look very, very, very different. In the U.S., I've found it's usually easier to get people to agree to conduct interviews with you via email. In Nopal and Peru and places, you really need, for example, you need an in. You need someone you need to work with like a local organization who then, that has a little bit of that have connections and some political clout and can find you connections with other people and so on. So, the structure of how it's done is different depending on where you are.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Great. And as well, this is thinking about the team you have in place and who is going to be reaching out and setting up these interviews might be important or a useful tool as well, because each of your team members might have different connections that you can use to reach out to some of your interviewees, or, might have different levels of clout that could get state officials to meet with you versus, they might not, Zurich, for example, might have some certain sway that ISET doesn't have. So it's just thinking about the team that you have in place and who should reach out to who, as well as an important part of organizing these interviews and sending out emails as well. Okay, next slide. So you've set up all these interviews, you have this lovely schedule, and you're in the field and ready to go out. And this first part here, the who, Kamini talked about this. So this is a little bit before in thinking about when you're identifying stakeholders and setting up the interviews. You want to think across sectors. So you want to interview key people and organizations who might be working in the disaster risk reduction realm within preparedness, response, and recovery. And you want to think across scales here as well, so both local, state, and maybe even the national level. You think about decision makers and planners whose work might affect risk, such as planning authorities, municipal authorities, or local governments. You might want to interview community groups, local or international NGOs working in the affected areas. Also those who are responsible for providing key services, such as electricity or water treatment, solid waste management, transportation, and communication. And then also,
Yep. Oh, sorry. Every time this unmutes, it cuts off. But
Yep.
no, I just wanted to mention that sometimes certain groups of people can be very, very difficult to reach. So, for example, in Boulder, during the Boulder floods in 2013, a heavily impacted group were the undocumented were undocumented workers in the area, and you can't. There's no way you can just go and access them. You can't just show up at their house and expect them to talk to you. And for that, you often have to go through civil society organizations that represent those groups and are able to speak about their experiences. What we did in Houston, for example, is we actually went to the Mexican consulate because they had connections to that community. So, so sometimes you have to get a little bit creative about how you access certain groups of people because they are not easy to reach.
And this is also, this delves a little bit into the how part of the interviews, but for those, for example, undocumented immigrants, you also have to think about the risk they may feel or that you may be putting them in by asking them, for an interview. So I'll get into the how after I finish the who, but it just brings up an important point that we want to make sure that we're protecting the identities of the people that we're interviewing. So just to round out the who as well, thinking about the communities, households, and businesses that were impacted by the disaster, and possibly those who weren't as well, if there's reason to believe that a lack of impact was due to preparedness, for example, or mitigation actions. So that could provide a lot of insight into what certain businesses did that helped them to avoid impacts that other businesses unfortunately, had from disasters. So that can provide a valuable story and lessons learned from that. And then, thinking about local or national academics or experts, again, who might have insight into why the event unfolded as it did. And this could include people with insights into the context of vulnerability in the area, historical and current land use, enforcement, science, political context, and so on. So you really want kind of a broad approach to who you're trying to interview just to cover an holistic analysis as you can. Can anybody think of any that we may have forgotten on this list that maybe if you've had any experience with interviews that you think could provide insight? You can just chat or unmute yourselves if there is any, anybody that we forgot here.
I was thinking maybe news organizations, that are used to or have covered these events. There must have been several who were very much involved in that. So reporters, news organizations.
Great.
Yep, that's a really good one. In South Carolina, there was a reporter that we talked to that had a pretty long history of reporting on this kind of stuff. I think in Houston, we tried to reach out to reporters from the Houston Chronicle because they had a pretty fantastic series on Harvey, but we didn't manage to get a hold of them. But yeah, that's a good one.
And this is Michael. If I can just quickly add to that, I think that is also already part of the desk research part. Usually what the media has reported on the short notice as events are actually still unfolding and in the immediate aftermath. That is obviously your immediate entry point to gain a good overview of the event. And potentially you can also already, talk to them over the phone on this as well. The caveat with this is that staying factual and ensuring that Perc has the right credibility and is flying at the right flight level is quite important. So you need to be careful not to be instrumentalized by media and to make sure that you can distinguish between, what is just an interesting topic for the media where they are banging their drums, and how can you extract that information factually and neutrally that will help serve your purpose as well. So just a small caveat there.
Thanks, Michael. Was there someone else that was about to say anything?
This is Susan Homan again. I think I would add, and it might fit into, maybe it fits into core services provider, but we've spoken with recovery and rebuild organizations like Team Rubicon. I don't know how familiar you are to them, but gained a lot of information from their experience there with post-event.
Yep, that's great. And we have been, for previous perks, and for this one, we will be reaching out to Team Rubicon, but that's a great, example of organizations that, have been on the ground. Sorry, someone's typing. If you can mute yourself. Thanks. But yeah, organizations that have been on the ground dealing with the response and helping with the recovery can provide really valuable insight as well. So thanks for that example. Okay, so thank you all for sharing that. We'll move into the how to conduct interviews now. So, you want to go into it. We have kind of an email template where we introduce ourselves and explain the purpose of the perk and what we're doing. But you want to reiterate that during the interview at the beginning of it. If you're recording it, you obviously want to obtain consent, both for conducting the interview and recording the interview. Conduct the interview in the language that's preferred and chosen by the interviewee. So for Peru, most, if not all, of those interviews were conducted in Spanish. And then you want to think about appropriate questions to ask during the interview. And you want to think outside these guiding questions. So box 3, which is listed here, which is also in the PERC manual, details some guiding interview questions. But again, this is just a guideline. You also want to probe for details and kind of think outside of just these questions. Sorry, someone's still typing. If you don't mind muting yourself, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So the guiding interview questions we have here are questions for key disaster risk management, government, humanitarian aid, and safety net personnel, as well as community-based organizations and committees. So again, these are guiding questions. Not all of these questions are going to be pertinent to the person that you're interviewing. So you don't want to just take these questions, print them out, and then check it off as you go through them for the interview. That's not how we ideally conduct the interview. So if we could go into the next slide.
Yeah, sorry, that will be a moment.
Sorry, thanks. Great. Sorry, now I need to get to my next slide. Okay, so this kind of segues into the loose interview format that we use for the perks. They are usually, ideally, semi-structured, and while they focus on specific themes, they're not, again, this isn't a checklist that we've developed before you go in with questions. And I know this, when I did my first perk, was a little bit of an adjustment for me because I come from, I had just finished my dissertation where I developed an interview guide that was approved by, the ethics and review board. So my background, I was used to having this very structured system of questioning. So this was very different where we just went into these conversations with a broad idea of, the types of topics that we wanted to cover, but we didn't have a set list of questions that we wanted to go through, because this format allows for topics or, it could provide key insights that you aren't necessarily thinking of when you're developing questions. So it's a looser format that allows things to emerge throughout a conversation that you can dig into a little bit more. If something comes up that you hadn't thought of before, you can go down that line of questioning. So it allows you to deviate from the plan, basically, to explore these topics with the interviewee. Let's see, have any of you, Susan, I don't know if you used this type of format for the studies that you had done previously, but has anybody done these types of kind of semi-structured questionnaires that they'd like to share their experiences with a little bit?
Yes, this is Susan again. Yeah, and our team is doing a lot of this, but obviously it's in a little bit different context, just discovery in general about the insights that would be relevant to developing strategy in the space. But the structure is a bit like this. I've got to tell you though, I think that we had to learn and adjust along the way. We started our interview process around Thanksgiving time and have gotten a lot of interviews in since then. But this is your process. I'll be honest with you, what I'm seeing here could have saved us a lot of learning on the job, if you will, because it's not a very prescriptive method. And I've got to tell you, I think that what you're covering is really great, that right up front that we had to learn on as we were going through interviews, and then kind of reflecting on what could we have done better, so I'll just leave it at that. I think that you have a very robust interview process already in the way it's laid out based on what we've been able to do.
And Rachel, this is Michael. Are you planning to go into the trust and how to gain trust aspect in the future, or is this a good moment to touch base on that one?
This is a great moment if you're willing to dive into that.
Sure, because I think it's also a part of the how. So I think first of all, we need to understand that we're effectively asking a lot of parties a favor to spend time with us and provide some insights. And they might come from very different starting points in terms of, we need to be careful what we say, where is this ending up? Is this just a kind of another approach to criticize our agency? They may have had bad experiences in talking to media or to researchers or to anybody else. And in the end, especially if they feel that something had already gone pear-shaped in how they handled the event, that this is all about attributing blame. So very typically, especially with emergency management organizations or flood managers and the like, obviously after an event, they are quite wary and they feel they need to be careful with what they say. So it's really important that you try to gain the trust of your interviewees and that you highlight to them that you're really coming from the position of you don't want to blame or do harm to anyone, and that this is really about neutral learning, and also in terms of the procedures, and we'll come to that also in, when we talk about the report writing and how you put the puzzle pieces together, but that people are not on the record, and you wouldn't put a quote in a report saying, and Mr. Smith said our systems have failed and we need to do better next time. Obviously that is not the intention of the report. So at the outset, and also as you start asking your initial questions, you really need to make sure that you can gain the trust of your interview partners by asking very open questions at the beginning, by making sure that you're interested in their expertise and in their learning, and that you want to really get them to a position where they can say and feel comfortable saying things that they wouldn't necessarily say to somebody they feel is just assessing their performance. And if you're successful in doing so, we've seen a couple of cases in the past where people really opened up and felt, also by giving them the right examples, you know, showing them an old report, showing them an outline, etc., that they can use us in transporting a message, somewhat anonymized or somewhat, you know, as part of a wider puzzle, that they always wanted to say anyway, but didn't really find somebody was listening. Maybe their boss has a different restriction, the budgets aren't there, there's other kind of, you know, mechanisms that restrict them from saying it as a maybe public figure or on the record. But in here, they can give us really valuable information that we can then use and transport and, you know, package as part of a wider puzzle. And that is extremely powerful if, you know, the regional leader of a flood agency tells you, oh, and here's what we think is really a challenge or the nuts that we're trying to crack, and how about, you know, these and these things are being thought of in the future. So gaining the trust and being able that people see you as a resource where they can transport the message makes Perc also extremely powerful. And let me stop there.
And
hey, Michael? Michael?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, New York City wants to weigh in, specifically Reese May.
Hey, Reese here with SBP, really loving all the information and excited for the Perc analysis to come. Just Bart and I were thinking about the sort of reticence that sometimes leaders of public agencies may have about weighing in on things, and I just wanted to share with this group that I'm sure most of you know, but in North Carolina, there have been a handful of disasters, two in particular, over the last few years. It was Hurricane Matthew back in 2016, and then Hurricane Florence, we all know, last year. Many of the government agencies have failed to mount a thoroughgoing long-term recovery plan for those communities that were affected back in 2016. There's been a fair amount of private and public criticism between state and federal government and in between state government agencies themselves about what has and hasn't happened over the last few years in two storms worth of recovery. So I just want to put that on everybody's radar as a little bit of a background condition is that you may find public officials who are even more sensitive to this kind of stuff than in a typical environment. End of transmission. That's it for me.
Thanks, Reese. That's really good to know. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to add and to kind of reflect or build a little bit earlier on what Michael was talking about. I mean, our experience suggests that something that you might deal with as folks from Zurich or folks associated with Zurich. I mean, we're an independent research organization as ISET, but even just writing in the emails that we were funded by Zurich Insurance to do this made people automatically think that we were claims officers. So it's really, really important that you learn how to manage that, especially if you're going to be going and talking to businesses. There will be a lot of hesitation at first in opening their doors to you. And the other thing that you might find as well is people asking you, like, I mean, there are a bunch of other people asking these kinds of questions, like, why are you doing this too? Because, I mean, the post-disaster phase, it's a learning opportunity for a lot of different groups. You have universities that are sending their grad students out to collect similar information and so on, but you have to really be very clear about what the value of the Perc is and how it's a little bit different from what is probably happening otherwise. So those are some of the more specific issues that you might be dealing with as you're trying to organize these interviews.
Great. Thanks. Does anybody else have anything along these lines that they wanted to bring up here? I think as well, we talked a little bit about, informed consent here and the ethical issues around that. Again, emphasizing that you're a neutral party and trying to gain trust. It's also in thinking about, if you are reaching out to marginalized people who are already more vulnerable to these types of events, it's just good to keep in mind that they may have a long history of kind of arbitrary administrative treatment and prejudice that they have experienced. So really thinking about how their testimony might put them at risk. Again, it's just important to highlight that we will be protecting people's identities in the report moving forward, and that if we were in the Houston Perc, we did end up using little vignettes. We didn't use people's names. We changed their names, but it was still little vignettes about their experience. So, going back to make sure that they have given consent for that is important, obviously. But in really thinking about who you're interviewing, just what everybody, echoing what everybody else has said, it's important to think about gaining that trust and what these interviews and the information that they're giving might mean for the interviewee as well. And then it's also, we use Snowball Sampling for conducting the interviews. We've, as we said in the previous slides, we reach out to people that we've identified to try to connect with them in the field, but we also ask people for recommendations for who to reach out to or who we should talk to next. And this can be really helpful. There's a difference between emailing someone and asking for an interview versus having somebody that they know saying, hey, I spoke with Rachel from ISET. They're doing a really interesting, study of this event. I think you should talk to them. So there's just having that kind of face-to-face experience can help gain that trust and legitimacy for potentially talking to other people. And we use snowball sampling as well. It's, for statisticians out there, it's definitely not, we're not drawing from a sample that you would say would be representative of the population. It's definitely more of a qualitative exercise and a way of forming a coherent narrative for the Perc. And let's see. This will also help us identify people that we might not have thought of before. Is there anything else on snowball sampling, Michael or Kamini, that I should add there?
Not from my end, thank you.
Okay. And then the last part, thinking about preparing and conducting interviews, is thinking about who on your team is going out to do these interviews. So we talked a little bit about the strength of a diverse team on Monday and how that can really strengthen the Perc. And this is where it can help as well in thinking about who you have on the team. And for example, if you have Karen, who is a colleague at ISET, is really has a strong background in kind of the physical aspects of disasters and hydrology. So if we were going to go interview an academic whose expertise was in that area, we would probably send Karen versus me, for example. I do not have any sort of background in hydrology. So you want to think about how you can really use the diversity and strength of your field team as you're conducting these interviews as well. Next slide, please. So again, we're still on kind of the preparing and conducting interviews phase of this. But this is where we want to bring back the 5 capitals framework, because you want to make sure that you're conducting a holistic analysis of the event, both in terms of geography and in terms of the topic. So, we focused on Houston, the metropolitan area, for example, but within that, we went to several different areas in Houston to make sure that we were drawing that more holistic approach and analysis of the event. And you don't want to focus on just one capital or theme, but you really want to utilize the frameworks that we have, so the 5 capitals and the 4R approach to strengthen the analysis so that you know you're looking at financial capital and natural capital. And so this is the framework is a good way to just remind yourself, oh, we haven't really interviewed someone from this capital, for example, because that can help also to ensure that you're exploring both the direct and indirect impacts and cascading failures of the event that you're studying. And can be a check of, am I getting the full story, or am I missing, a key aspect of the story that I should really try to flesh out a little bit more. And thinking about providing a balanced view, I mean, this is hard. I'll acknowledge that as well, that, we all have our perspective on the world, which again is where a diverse team can come in to question kind of the information that you're getting. Like, can you take the findings at face value, or is there another side? Is there somebody that you need to talk to make sure that you're getting both sides of the story? And getting the facts validated or verified, is important as well. So somebody tells you something, can you take it at face value? Is there information that backs up what they're saying? Or do you need to, go back to your desk research and see if there's something that contradicts what they're saying, or if it does, in fact, verify what they're saying? And using the 5 capitals, you can get a broad stakeholder base, but you also want to make sure that you're getting a balance of opinions from all of these different stakeholders, especially if they have opposing interests or perspectives as well.
And you'll be, sorry, what you'll be finding is that you will be starting this analysis process while you're doing the interviews, because that in-between car time is so important, because before the interviews, it's prepping kind of what you want to ask your interviewee about. So, for example, if you've already talked to a water expert and the next person you're talking to is also a water expert, you want to talk to them to fill in the gaps from the previous interview, or if you don't feel like the previous person was terribly candid with you, you can verify information. And then after the interview part is a really good time to discuss what you heard, how it fits into the wider story that's a part of this holistic analysis. So, all of these things are happening together. They're happening in tangent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to reiterate, we're presenting this pretty linearly today. But this is not necessarily a step, do this and then you do this and then you do this. It's very kind of a circular process, especially when you're in the field, as Conmany said, doing these interviews, because you do want to be constantly analyzing the information you're getting so that you can inform potential next interviewees, both in terms of who you're reaching out to and the topics that you want to cover. So it's definitely more of a circular process than, what it might look like here as we're just going from slide to slide to slide. Okay, thank you. So, Conmany brought up the analysis. So this part here that we're looking at is so to reiterate, you do the analysis as you're doing the interviews, but you're also going to do a lot of the analysis after you're done with the interviews. And this part is really where you're deconstructing what happened and why the hazard manifested in the way it did and why it became a disaster. And this section is also key for really identifying those entry points for building resilience. And so you do not want to just describe the hazard and the event. That is part of the report structure that we talked about, but you really want to dig in here to think about how we can understand the link between a natural event and an unnatural disaster. So really figuring out why the hazard manifested in the way it did. And this is really kind of the fundamental approach here. So that's important to just think about this. And we have, 4 frameworks outlined here that can help you in unpacking all the information you have. Because, for example, we have the DRM cycle here, and you really want to organize and begin to analyze your information kind of around this cycle and across the systems that you have here. So you want to think about the interaction between systems, agents, and institutions, and what's going on with the different types of capitals. So it's not just about physical infrastructure, for example, but there's also those other types of capitals that we talked about here. So really, all of these frameworks help you to have a broad analysis and holistic analysis to what is going on with this event. Stephen, did you want to talk a little bit about your experience in Vietnam?
Hi. Yeah. This might be a useful time. I mean, there are several reports that you have on the website about the various Perc studies that have been done. Rachel and Kamani have referred to them and from their own experience, but I can kind of tell a little story about our experience in the early days with that helped reveal the value of this approach. This was in the city of Quy Nhon in Vietnam, in central Vietnam, and if you'll give me the liberty here of taking a few minutes to sort of lay out the experience for you, I can think it might help see how all these pieces fit together. So just outside the city, there is a floodplain area which has a densely populated agricultural community. And because it's a monsoon climate and they have regular typhoons, the people are familiar with flooding, and in their historical experience, when the water overtops the levees along the river, which maybe happens every 10 or 20 years, it flows overland across the floodplain down to the delta and out into the ocean, replenishing the field. So it's easy to cope with. The water's 10 to 30 centimeters in depth, and generally rises slowly over the flood event and has positive features as well as negative. So in 2009, there was a major tropical storm that was forecast and expected. There was localized rainfall in this area in the evening, but 50 or 60 kilometers upstream in the mountains, the rainfall was much heavier and sat there for much longer. So as the night wore on, upstream reservoirs had to release emergency volumes of water, and as the water made its way down the river, it overtopped the levees along the river, and there were extensive property losses during the night and a fair amount of trauma for residents, but fortunately no fatalities. Now the official narrative about this flood was that it was due to the heavy upstream rainfall and reservoir releases, which is part of the story for sure. But when we got into the field, the local folks, the farmers who lived there, reported a very different and very alarming to them situation, that instead of the familiar flood situation where the water would run across the floodplain during the night, they reported a very rapid rise in water level, up to 1 or 2 meters. rising well over their doorways into the homes and structures, and then having continuing strong currents. They had no warning that this magnitude of flood was coming, but fortunately they had good cell phone coverage and strong social networks. So they were able to support each other and help their neighbors, help the elderly. Many of them had boats, so there was no loss of life, but a lot of them lost livestock and property during the night. So the question was, why was the water so deep and so sudden? And what had happened in the previous decade was that this area on the outskirts of the city had been increasingly developed. So there were new roads, improvements to the rail line, and large industrial or institutional sites like a new university campus built in the area. And all of these developments were built on a couple of meters of fill above the floodplain ground level and the surrounding farms. So that ensured they were protected from floods. And they had drainage culverts, but they were obviously not sufficient to cope with very extreme flows. So what happened during the flood as the water overtopped the levees during the night, so it wasn't immediately obvious to people, it quickly ran across the surface to the new road downstream and then backed up behind the road until it reached the height of the road or embankment, and then it overflowed into the next area and did the same thing. So these new developments built on the fill, like the university, filled up some of the flood retention area and forced the overland flow into a smaller area, so the water was deeper and faster. And so the floodplain had kind of developed into a series of flood cells, if you like, of varying size, about 1 to 3 meters below these new embankments and infrastructure. And while the new infrastructure was not seriously damaged because it was built up high, there was a lot of damage to the existing residents. So the residents, some of them had been aware of this risk as they had seen the development take place and had tried to complain about it. But the official planners and the different agencies responsible for these different kinds of infrastructure had not really even noticed this problem emerging until the flood happened. So, you can see here how we can use the, looking at the systems perspective here. So we're looking at infrastructure that was built in an uncoordinated way, and we're looking at the institutional weaknesses in the planning system that didn't connect the planning and construction from different agencies who were responsible for the roads or the universities or the railway, and didn't have a sufficient drainage plan in place. But we can also see, if we think about the agents or the individuals, that there was a strength there because the community was able to respond very quickly to this unexpected threat in the middle of the night and organize themselves to rescue everybody with very little outside help. So but you can tell a story here by looking at these different perspectives. And, as people have pointed out, as Michael has pointed out, you have to be diplomatic about how this is presented. There's obviously been a failure here in terms of the planning systems, and you don't want to challenge the officials' professional competence. But because the study is made public, and because it explains in detail, in chronological sequence, what happened and why, based on the narratives of those people who were actually living there at the time, it's difficult to refute it. you can't just dismiss it and say, oh, you know, well, this is just somebody's opinion. And when the report is public and it's shared widely, it generated, in this case, quite a number of public and internal discussions in the local government that led to changes to the master plan and a more careful oversight of development in the future, as well as introduction of an early warning system and construction of evacuation routes and flood shelters. So the value of the study, by integrating these different perspectives and different sources of information, I think helped us to develop the methodology and framework. And you can kind of see how the pieces fit together there.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I think that's a really good example of how you can use these frameworks to really, as Stephen said, inform your study and the insights that you get out of it. Does anybody have any questions about Stephen's story? Or how these frameworks can be used to really support the analysis that happens during the Percs? I think as you're doing it, it definitely becomes clearer when you apply these, when you're doing the analysis. So once you're at that point, I think that's when these frameworks, you can really recognize how helpful they can be in deconstructing the event and how the hazard happened and why it manifested in the way it did. Okay, next slide. I think we're actually on the next one now.
Is it slow to respond, Rachel? I have to move to slide 23, the Perc sequence, 6 out of 8.
We were just, I think we're on 24 now, so.
So you want to see 24, is that what you say?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Good.
Perfect, thanks. So delving a little bit more into the agents, institutions, and systems framework that we have here. Pretty self-explanatory with the diagrams. So systems, include ecosystems. So this could be forests, grasslands, river corridors, etc. It also includes infrastructure systems, electricity, water, wastewater treatment, communications, and the services they provide as well. So the systems are really the what component of resilience, and the institutions are the how component. So it refers to the rules, norms, beliefs, or conventions that mediate human interactions. And they control access to resources, services, assets, information, and influence. And then the agents are the people and the organizations. So these are the who component. And this can include households, communities, private and public sector organizations, companies, etc. And so all of these components here interact. And we have a few examples here of what as applied to a Perc study. So, for example, in Houston, regulation around development in and around the Barker reservoirs was pretty non-existent. So as a result of this, there were thousands of homes that flooded, of homes in or around these reservoirs that flooded as a result of this lack of regulation. So just looking, applying this framework to that, you can see how, the failure of institutions contributed to the impact of the event here and how it became a disaster moved from a hazard and became a disaster here. Kamini, would you mind digging into the South Carolina dam example and explaining that with this framework?
Yeah, sure. So the South Carolina, so this is actually something that we saw in a news report, and it was, so the flooding in Columbia, in South Carolina was really, it was really caused by a series of dam failures, and it was a series of dam failures that occurred largely because of a lack of oversight. And just to demonstrate how complex that can be, there was one dam, it was privately owned. I can't remember if this woman even entirely knew that she owned it or not, because it was an old dam that was built as kind of, they have a series of agricultural dams there that were built in order to provide irrigation for farms. And then over time, they've become dams that basically created lakefront properties. And with this particular dam, this woman owned it. It was privately owned. There's still supposed to be some oversight by the state government, but because you have thousands upon thousands of these dams and you don't have enough money allocated for the actual oversight, I don't think they ever got around to actually inspecting that dam. On top of that, who actually is responsible for the dam is very complicated, because it has a road on top of it that is owned by the local DOT. So, at that point, it becomes a question of, okay, who is actually responsible for maintaining this dam? Is it the woman because she privately owns it, or is it the DOT because they're allowing cars and other vehicles to go on top of it, which is causing wear and tear on the dam? And ultimately, in that kind of mixed ownership confusion, nothing ever, that dam was never maintained, and it failed during the floods. So that's an example of, once again, kind of this confusion around regulation that resulted in a point of failure.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions about kind of this analysis deconstruction phase, or about this framework itself and how its applicability for really helping to understand what happened in a disaster? Are there any questions about any of that section? I'll wait a second for the chat, or if anybody wants to chime in and unmute, feel free.
Another common example that we see is where you have, levees being built, and you have what we call the Levee Effect. So the levee is built because there is this understanding that, oh, levee will protect people. It is physical protection infrastructure. But what you often see is that it's not supported by any real kind of regulatory landscape or series of building codes that actually prevents development behind or adjacent to the levee. You don't see adequate money actually being put in over a long period of time for maintenance. You don't often see, levees are talked about. This is kind of the risk awareness part. You see levees being talked about as protection infrastructure, but it's not often acknowledged that they have design thresholds. So, that's another example of where you have issues between, you have issues sort of like how Stephen was talking about kind of systems being built in silo or in isolation from understanding of how people might interact with it or respond to it, or in silo from the kinds of regulations that exist and the kinds of regulations that might not be put forward to actually enable the integrity of that infrastructure or enable it to actually protect the area in the way it's supposed to do so over a long term. So, I mean, that's kind of another example of how you see this stuff playing out, and very much the interaction between, I mean, why you need this more holistic analysis that looks not only at the systems that are there, but also the regulatory landscape that manages how people interact with those systems.
Thanks, Kamini. And along those same lines, I mean, looking at this framework, I think it's pretty intuitive. I mean, we all know that this is kind of how the world works in a sense, but where I think this framework is really helpful is for just deconstructing, again, the event and really looking at these specific pieces and their interactions and what happened there. So I think it's just really helpful for taking us back to kind of these core components, agents, institutions, and systems when we are analyzing all the information that we have. So it's a really helpful tool. Are there any other
questions if you think it's kind of abstract still? And I'm sure we could find more examples to provide.
I have a couple questions. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, my name's Kenzie. I work at ICLR as a research associate. And I really like the Perc framework, and I like that you do the semi-structured interviews because I've done those in the past, and I think they just make the interview process a lot more comfortable for both parties and builds the trust like Michael was talking about. But I do have a couple questions for pertaining specifically to interviews. Is there a specific number of interviews that are required for a Perc study? And then how long are the interviews meant to be, or is it open because of the semi-structured nature?
Kamini, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think you're trying to get as many interviews as possible. So there's no set number that we're trying to attain. Just the more information, the better is generally our approach, I think. I
will say that typically I think on average, we've conducted between 40 and 60 interviews, just depending on the size of our field team.
Okay.
So the earlier Percs, which was just me and Karen, I mean, those were, and especially if they're in like Peru or in Nepal where you're organizing stuff from a distance or having to travel long distances to make it to places, we ended up doing fewer interviews. In Houston, I think we did close to 60 interviews because we had 4 people on our field team. And so we could divide and conquer a lot more. But, I mean, you do kind of get a feel for what the natural end point is for conducting interviews. I mean, yes, more information is better, but at one point you hear the same things over and over again.
Right.
And that kind of leads you to kind of conclude that, okay, we're probably done at this point and we don't need any more.
Right.
So it's not the most straightforward answer, but you do really get a feel for it.
So I guess for the length of the interviews too, it's pretty open.
We usually try to keep them to an hour.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, people are taking their time to talk to us. I mean, there are some people that are far more comfortable with interviews going on for longer. We have sat with people for 1.5 to 2 hours before, but you really just have to gauge that in the interview, and other people are just waiting to get you out of the door. So it depends, and I think you just need to be aware of where you are and who you're talking to.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that saturation point that Kamini made is important because you can get a sense of, you know, when you're hearing the same information again, and also, you know, after you've done the analysis, you might realize that you've missed a key perspective, or, you know, you should cover something that your information or analysis is showing that you have a gap. So while you might not be in the field, you could continue to do some phone interviews if you do recognize that you're missing the perspective of a key informant, or according to the 5 capitals, if you're missing information from one of those capitals that you really think would help flesh it out. So again, it's not a clear answer, but it's more based on the data that you're getting, as Kamini said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we've had some success as well with like doing follow-up interviews with some folks that we feel like we didn't get enough time with. And if we think that they'll be able to fill some gaps, we just sometimes reach back out to the same interviewees, and they're able to fill in some of those gaps. So,
great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? I'm not seeing any chats. Great. If we can move to the next slide. Okay, so step 7. So report, draft writing, and consolidation. Again, we're focusing on the report here. You may decide to do a report, or you'll have some other format for the Perc learning that you're drawing, that you're decide to make out of all the information that you've received from the interviews and the desk research. But this Perc structure, report structure that we have in the Perc manual is really helpful in structuring how you get a meaningful report that provides insights and recommendations out of all of this information. So, as we talked about earlier, it really does separate your information out, which is helpful because then instead of it being all of this information that is just, a conglomerate of everything that everybody has said for the past 2 weeks, you can begin to kind of highlight, okay, this is relevant to section 1, the physical context, or this falls into section 2, of what happened, or section 3, what happened. And then from that, you can begin to pull out the key insights. And again, this is where an interdisciplinary team or diverse team can be helpful. You can do this report by yourself, but it might be easier to pull together if you have somebody that, can really dial in on the physical context and get, is comfortable writing about what happened in that regard. Or if, someone's familiar with more like the socioeconomic disaster landscape, then you would want to kind of tap them to write that section. So the key here too is just figuring out the story that you want to tell, and the structure provides a way to tell that story. And yep, next slide.
Yeah, and how we've kind of typically done this, at least within ISET, is, we will organize a 2 or 3 day powwow over which we go through all of the notes and pretty much do a brain dump of exactly what should go into what section. The notes are super useful for that, but also your own memory serves, and your own kind of ongoing analysis serves as a really useful way to just kind of sit together with a structure, kind of a base outline up on a projector screen, and then just start filling out all of the different pieces together. And it starts to form quite quickly doing that. It's not neat by any means, but none of this ever is.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's, flexibility for figuring out in this section what works for you and your team. As Kamini said, for ISET, it worked for us just to kind of put all our heads together, come up with a report outline, and then we split up all the pieces and started fleshing out the sections. But you might have a different approach to how you write reports. So I would just, use what works for you and for your team as well in thinking about how to really structure, or to flesh out all of these different sections as well. And that reminded me as well that during the field work, it's often helpful to kind of have these group get-togethers where you're putting all, after a long day of interviewing or after 3 days of interviewing, where you are rehashing everything that you've talked about in your interviews, and you can begin to start writing notes for the report from that as well. So again, this highlights the non-linearity of the process. So you can start to kind of flesh out what the report is going to look like and what you're going to put in it as the interviews are happening as well. Okay, and then just as a reminder, in looking at the what happened section, this provides the detail of exactly what happened. So this is not an analysis heavy section. It's really just providing the information about, the event. So for Hurricane Harvey, we talked about how it made landfall, and then, how much rain fell over the ensuing days, and what, how the floods manifested as a result of that. So there's not, again, a lot of analysis that's going on in that section. Really, where it's going to be analysis heavy is in the physical context, the socioeconomic disaster landscape, and key insight sections. So that's really where you're going to be applying all of those frameworks to help you understand kind of the landscape and the context, and which will help you develop key insights and recommendations there. Next slide. So again, we want to take the time here to kind of think about the different types of recommendations that can come out of a Perc study. In the reports, you can do them around the DRM cycle, so you can have recommendations that are pertinent to preparedness, that are pertinent to response and recovery and risk reduction. However, again, it's important to note that there might be some recommendations that are cross-cutting, that aren't going to just neatly fall into each of these categories. And what we have here, this diagram, is just to show that we are coming up with broad recommendations. We are not necessarily coming up with specific interventions for people to implement, because it's so context specific. So really, the idea is for the recommendations to be tangible, and so that people who read the report can take that recommendation and then apply it to their own context. So one example of a recommendation is that partnerships and relationships are fundamental to resilient response and recovery. And this was an insight and recommendation from the Harvey Perc. And so where you can maybe do an intervention is Houston, for example, I think it was after Hurricane Maria, developed kind of a command center where everybody was co-located and had the physical space to coordinate response and long-term recovery. Or you could come up with an intervention that supports long-term recovery groups collaborating over time. So whatever that might look like, specific to the state or area that you're working within. Michael, I didn't know if you wanted to go to the website now to kind of look at the Perc Medley report and the forensic wrap-up report and the solutions database, if that worked for you. I'll pass, and if you don't mind, I'll pass the microphone to you, Michael, because I think you're more familiar with this, with the website than I am.
I think you're muted, Michael.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, sorry, not sure what, Michael's having some issues with his microphone, but we can just look through the website that he has here. So, and this website just has, so he's scrolling through the perks that we've created to date. So this is kind of a repository of all of the perks that have been created thus far. Many of them are in the report format. Actually, most of them that we're showing here are in the report format that we've talked about throughout this presentation. And there's, you know, just different types. Again, this is looking at the different contexts and the different areas for where all of these floods occurred. Let's see. And, you know, looking at all these different reports, we also wanted to emphasize that there might be parallels with some of the reports that you're already doing. So a risk engineering report, for example, and policy recommendations, et cetera. So this is, Kamini, can you talk a little bit about this insight report for me?
Yeah, I think.
So this is the Perc Medley report that has kind of cumulative key findings from most of the reports that we've done.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, so what you find, I mean, what we at least found as we continued to conduct a bunch of these perks was that, I mean, you have what we call kind of global emerging learning. And I think Michael might have gone through some of them in the first webinar, but it's basically these points of like learning that we see that keep coming up over and over and over again across the different reports that we've done. I mean, the failure of physical infrastructure is a big one, especially protection infrastructure, and it's largely because of a lack of a regulatory landscape around it. Another big one is that, I mean, coordination and relationships and collaboration are a really huge part of having a successful DRM system or disaster risk management system at large. Another big one is that recovery is never really planned for, that not enough money is put into risk reduction, that much of the money goes into building back to the status quo or building back to worse conditions versus actually leveraging funding to build back better. So these are, I mean, these are just some examples of the kinds of things that we see across locations and contexts. I mean, these are lessons that we see not only pop up in Nepal and in Peru, but also in the U.S. They just kind of manifest in different ways. And a big takeaway from that is really kind of the value of the Perc to be a source of learning, not only in the location that you're conducting the Perc, but across locations. So there's a real potential for lateral learning with the Percs. And I mean, how you socialize it, how you disseminate it will really kind of impact that, but that just know that the kinds of recommendations and things that you're coming up with might actually have implications well beyond the jurisdiction or the geographic bounds that you're looking at. Yeah.
Thanks, Kamini.
So I'm trying again here. Can people hear me now? This is Michael speaking.
You're here, yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure what happened, so I'm back on, and you can obviously, you know, continue providing advice what you want to show, but I should be able to speak now as well. If others can just press their own mute button again. I have unmuted all the lines, so that seemed to fix the problem. But if others could mute themselves again by pressing their own mute button, please. Okay, so Rachel, back to the medley report, or shall I also show the external Perc page on the flood resilience portal?
I think we've covered those, unless there's something else that you wanted to add specifically on either of those.
Yeah, just quickly going to our Perc flood resilience site that we have. So floodresilience.net is our overall flood resilience portal, where we share all of our knowledge and make it available in terms of open source. So that should be coming up now on the screen. Can you confirm, Rachel?
Yes, we can see it.
Exactly. So that is our flood resilience portal with all the overall resources that we have, a lot of learning, a lot of various things. And if you just add /Perc to it, you'll get taken to a dedicated Perc page. Again, the Perc manual and some of the Perc reports are available here for download as well. But what we also have created is a searchable database, an inventory on Perc recommendations. So in here you can filter, you have the various abilities in terms of how we view resilience. So you can filter by 4 R's, by the capitals, country filters, DRM language cycle filters, etc. Or you can just also type in various search functions, and you would be taken to those recommendations that match the search query. So in that case, you really have the ability also to search a growing repository of the practical actionable recommendations that we have created. So we'll keep adding to those as Perc reports keep coming in. And they would also take you to the report itself if you want to read up about more about the context. At the same time, recommendations, unlike key insights, are rewritten in a way that are actionable and apply to a variety of audiences irrespective of the context. So in order to understand the recommendation here, you don't have to understand the full report or read the full context, but these should be really self-explanatory and practical for implementation. So that's just what I wanted to highlight. And also in the spirit of looking forward, obviously, we really try to have a growing repository of Percs. We're trying to get you all excited about doing your own Perc studies, but then it would be ideal if you could help us fill this repository. So as new Perc reports may be produced by you, if you can get in touch with the gatekeeper of the Flood Resilience portal, it would be really great to highlight that you're producing these reports, and if we can tap into that knowledge as well to make the library bigger and bigger. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. So if we could go back to the PowerPoint when you can. And if you can remind her to mute yourselves, I think we've got some background noise there. Thank you. Great. So I think you can go to the next slide then. So we've reviewed the Perc sequence, and we've now made it into a timeline here. Sorry, can whoever's not muted try to mute themselves? Okay. Okay. Sorry. So it doesn't, the key here. Sorry, can people mute themselves?
Yeah, I'll try. I probably have to take here the, you know, the rigorous approach again.
Okay.
I'll mute everybody.
Hey, chat in the box if you have any questions, and once we get to the Q&As, we'll open it back up again. So what we have here is kind of a timeline of what we've talked about over the past couple hours here. You know, the event occurs, you identify the event for the Perc and begin desk research, develop areas of interest and research questions, all the way through to continued engagement. But I think what's important to note here is that, again, we are showing you a linear process, but it's not. As you can see here, you have continual desk research almost throughout the entire process, all the way to publication. And the deconstruction and analysis part as well doesn't just happen in a set time frame. You're really starting that after you've developed your areas of interest, again, all the way through until publication. And then even after publication, it doesn't stop there. The idea is to really continue engagement around the report, to work with people that you talk to on how the PERC can be relevant to them and on providing them, you know, with meaning that has meaning to them, I guess. And again, here we wanted to note that the PERC is never complete. There's always more to learn and ask and explore, but at some point you do have to decide that you know enough and that you can write about it. There's never, for example, an after action report that is complete. There will always be something else that you might want to add to it, but again, you just have to pick that point where you've decided that it's time to publish and move forward from that. So again, reiterating here what Michael talked about on Monday, just in terms of what a PERC is not. It's not a performance review. We're not trying to attribute fault or blame to anybody, and it's not an assessment on behalf of someone. We're trying to really be neutral and independent in this regard.
It's also worth noting, can you hear me? I don't know if we're all still muted.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, so it's also worth noting that, I mean, in the past we have done kind of follow-up, we've had like follow-up products that kind of came out of the PERC. So in Peru, there was a big conversation nationally going on around housing recovery and also just more broadly the appropriation of recovery funding. And so we wrote 2 policy briefs to support our local partner in the area, Practical Action, because they were involved in those national dialogues. You might find similar things here as well, like upon conducting the PERC, that one of your interviewees or your local partners or someone might reach out to you and be like, hey, this is actually a really opportune time to do like a short policy brief or something that can inform an ongoing policy dialogue, or maybe inform a particular nonprofit's work on something. So there is a lot of opportunity to actually kind of tailor your findings from the PERC to respond to ongoing needs. You just have to be kind of flexible in terms of responding to those opportunities. But you can often see some real learning and some real engagement around what you've been trying to say when you respond to those kinds of ongoing opportunities or emerging opportunities.
Thanks, Kamini. Yeah, and there's also, you know, she talks about how video could be another additional product or shorter briefs that come out of the report. There's also been some launch events that have occurred around the PERCs, as well as ongoing media coverage in some cases. So that can be a way to continue to engage around this report and keep it on people's radars as well. Okay, and then one last note is before you publish the report, you always want to circulate the report back to everybody that you interviewed for comment before finalizing any of the dissemination pieces. So whether it's the report or some other output that you come up with. And usually you'll get, some people won't respond, others will respond with comment, but with comments, but it is just important to get their feedback or at least have them know that you did ask them for their feedback before you finalized the pieces. And then of course, you want to send them a final copy of the report as well. And if there are any case studies that you use, you would, get a signed consent form from them that it's okay that they were including a little anecdote about them, again, with their names changed in the report for that. I think that's it for today. If you want to go to the next slide, Michael. While he's going to the next slide, are there any questions on anything that we've covered today? Oh, okay. Can you go to the next slide, Michael? Seems like there's a little delay in that, but basically what the next slide is just a reminder for you all to work on your mini perks and to send in slides if you're using slides before the third webinar. And so, ideally by the end of the day on January 22nd. And again, what we'll be covering on webinar 3 is just bringing all the pieces together, what we've talked about, presenting your mini case study, and really addressing any other final questions or comments that you might have. So, are there any questions?
I'm wondering, this is Kenzie again, I'm wondering if there's examples online of any events, like Perc events or videos that were made following previous ones? Or is it just the reports that I can find online?
I think the videos should be online.
Apologies, can you hear me? This is Michael.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
So somehow I dropped off, but you didn't. That's good. So please do carry on, or if there was a question or you wanted me to do something, then let me just know that.
We are on the, can you just move the slides ahead one, Michael? So that's just, and we'll address your question, Kenzie, sorry. And then you can keep, so just a reminder for the webinar 3, and then if you can advance to questions. Kenzie had a question about where we can find any of the other outputs aside from the reports. We have a video, Jennifer's saying that we have a video of the Houston event, and Kamini talked about the Peru video. Are those on the website?
There wasn't a Peru video. We did policy for Peru. There's a video for the Nopal Perc. I believe they're on the website. Michael might need to jump in on this because with the Nopal video.
So unfortunately, I actually don't have the knowledge, but I do remember there was a video, and maybe just Googling for that will give us the answer. But at the moment, I wouldn't know where it is residing actually, but I would actually guess it's on the ISET website, if I'm honest.
We can do some research too, Kenzie, to see if we can just find some of those videos and other outputs as well, and send it out to you. Any other questions, concerns, comments? Is everyone clear about the homework for the next webinar?
I mean, are there any parts of this, we've just dumped an entire methodology and way of thinking on you. What parts of this seem doable? What parts perhaps seem a little challenging? It would be great to get some feedback from you all.
Hi, this is Dan Gorham from IBHS. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Just some feedback, and I know my colleague Faraz and I had a lot of discussion last week, but just kind of a note about this, and as we're thinking about the Perc methodology and perhaps how we can use it as a foundation for what our objective is to specifically apply it to wildland fires. And kind of a question or a comment is about the time scale for conducting the PERC. And just, I just want to point out, from our perspective, we look at wildfires and trying to do the post-incident investigation and reconnaissance. It's really important for us to do it in a timely manner, like days or weeks after, and just kind of noting about what I understand of the PERC model, it can be sometimes months or years after the event, and I think a lot of that's just based on the data collection through interviews. So just a kind of a note, not a bad thing, but just an observation, and maybe if you had any thoughts on what your experience is with the time scale and if it can be compressed or if the long time scale maybe has some benefits.
So, I mean, I would say, so I don't think there are any PERCs that have been conducted years after the event. We do tend to wait for at least like 3 or 4 months to pass after the event, just because, I mean, the kind of information that you get after, like immediately after, at least in the case of a flood, it's very different from the kind of information that you're going to get a couple of months out. It's really hard, for example, to get kind of people to even start thinking about long-term recovery issues and how you can leverage an upcoming long-term recovery process to build resilience and so on if they're still kind of in disaster response mode. Because what we're trying to do is not just collect information on impacts, which might be more obvious immediately after, but it's more kind of understanding the longer term implications of what's happening. So I've never done a PERC in a wildfire situation before, and I think it's very worth discussing how we would have to modify the methodology and perhaps the time frame in order to make that work. But at least in the case of a flood, and I would say for a lot of disasters, that you would want to wait for a couple of months out from the event, just so your interviewees are also kind of in a place where they're able to put things into a longer term perspective.
And this is Dan again. I just want to agree completely. I think that all makes sense. And sorry for, I'm not trying to stir the pot. It was just kind of an observation, but I agree. I think during earlier in the presentation, you were asking for examples, and I was guilty of having some technology trouble. But I'll provide an anecdotal story from Faraz and I. We had visited the city of Paradise, California, about 6 weeks after the Camp Fire had passed through. And we were doing our data collection essentially with, pictures and doing that kind of drive around. But we did have an opportunity to stop at a home where the resident had come back, and his home that was standing was in a community of otherwise pretty much completely destructed area. And we were able to have an informal interview in that way. And I found that to be really productive and informative, but I can appreciate that what you just made is it was even only 6 weeks after, there was still a lot of emotional tie to the event. And he had commented that his daughter lived just up the block and her house had been destroyed. So yeah, just kind of a note, and thanks for providing the perspective.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it would be hugely beneficial as well to do kind of a couple of rounds of interviews, but that's also kind of funding permitting, right? So if you're able to resource your study so that you're able to go in 6 weeks after and then a couple of months after, that would be fantastic, because the kind of information that you would get would be quite different. But yeah, I think it really just depends on how you're setting up your study and how you're kind of resourced. But yeah, the information that you get from people who are having that lived experience is certainly very, very rich. Yeah. Any other questions or comments or feedback?
So this is Michael. No, just from my end to iterate, that this process is really kind of an open approach, where the methodology provides you with guidance, but based on your peril, based on your interest, your target audience of what you want to produce. Again, timelines might shift, the appropriate moment to go in and go out of the event might shift. For us, it's just important because it is not a performance review and we're not kind of the first responders on the scene. We really need to have a light touch approach, and we can't really mingle with the emergency responders and need to make sure we don't distract people from doing their key job as this is still being, handled as a crisis situation. So we typically say we shouldn't come in before this has moved on from being a crisis intervention to at least some portion of, coping with the aftermath and then going into recovery mode. And it is a delicate balance of not being too late, so people don't remember anymore, people have already shifted their priorities and the like, and the traces are not yet being, deleted or eradicated, but at the same time, you don't want to come in too early, and I think that's just a balance to keep in mind. And again, it depends on what you do, what your purpose is, and what the situation, depending on the peril and the event is. And that's also bringing us across to the point where, a Perc is never complete. So focus a little bit on what your key hypotheses and your key leading or guiding questions are and how you want to follow up on them. And once you have this credible and satisfactorily complete picture, I think that's then when you feel comfortable in writing it all up and providing those insights and recommendations.
Yeah, and I mean, just following up on Michael's point as well as just the flexibility that there is. I mean, yeah, it is an open methodology, and we have interpreted and reinterpreted the methodology that we have several times. I mean, when we did the South Carolina Perc, we ended up doing more of a comparative analysis between Charleston and Columbia, where the types of flooding were very, very different, and their exposure and experience of flooding was also very different. I mean, Charleston gets very frequent flooding as a result of tides, whereas, I mean, Columbia hadn't experienced flooding in decades. In Houston, we kind of reinterpreted the style of writing a little bit, at least, where we had all of these different vignettes, because, I mean, we'd focused that particular Perc more on the experience of businesses and kind of the role of businesses in resilience at large. And it was hard to tell kind of one story about what happened when really businesses had dealt with the floods in so many different ways. So what we did was a series of vignettes of the different types of things that that had been done. So, I mean, in that regard, the methodology, and especially that report structure section, I think is just a guide for kind of the level of information you might need to collect and the kinds of questions you need to ask to get to kind of more legitimate and credible key insights. But how you present that and how you choose to communicate that might just differ wildly depending on the context that you're in and what you kind of want to say. So there is a lot of flexibility, and the manual is really just a guide.
Any other questions, comments? Great. Michael, did you want to wrap up, or is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think there's nothing to add on the progress we've made in terms of explaining the methodology and the approaches. I think it was also very good to have this more interactive discussion. But I also think that speaks to the fact that people are really interested and have read up on quite a few key things and lean in with their experience weight. So that's really appreciated. Made it a lot interactive. Just in terms of then the next steps, so please do progress on your homework. Please send in your 3 slides by Tuesday evening. That would be helpful, so we can then all look at your results. Again, this is a very focused mini Perc exercise, but just try to get your head around some of the basic concepts and steps, and I think that will also unveil any remaining questions that haven't come up yet. And that's also how we want to structure then the third part of the webinar next week, that we, will go through the methodology guide again and, ensure that everybody has digested and fully understood this. Then we'll look at the Perc mini sequence and have a more extensive Q&A depending on what doubts or challenges have come up to ensure we all feel prepared. So that's really it for me on this end of the phone line. But if other people now want to have final observation and comments, there's still plenty of time. So don't feel urged to leave just yet. If there's any discussions needs, please identify them now. Thank you. All people should now be unmuted again. So if there's any other question and people haven't been able to unmute themselves, that is definitely an opportunity for people to speak up and ask questions again.
Michael, this is Peter Haig from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And my question is, first of all, the Houston Perc is extremely well done and thorough, and I thought that many of the observations were challenging for society as a whole, I think, and for Houston in particular. I'm just wondering what kind of response you've gotten, and do you have any anecdotes in terms of how well received the report has been, and whether you see the report being taken up by officials and decision makers in the Houston area? And I'll go back on mute.
Thanks, Peter, and I guess that is a very good question. What is the follow-up capacity that we have? And it also depends a little bit on the mandate that either you have as an organization or that you give yourself as an organization. So for us, clearly, we do not have that specific mandate, and we need to tread lightly in terms of following up and asking the question, so have you implemented any of this? There has been, some intermittent dialogue with various agencies, in particular the Harris County Flood Control District. And I think that's definitely the most interesting one, particularly to follow up with, given the implementation job that they have to do, and also the recent developments in terms of the $2.5 billion grant that needs to be administered to increase flood resilience overall. There have been quite a few communications also in the media. It's been picked up nationwide, and that has spawned some dialogue. So I think at a higher level, that's really good. But specifically, it hasn't been the case that, we reached out to all our interviewees to schedule follow-up interviews, for example. And it also depends a little bit on later development. So as part of Florence, given that we have had Perc Joaquin covering South Carolina just a couple of years earlier, I think that is really the best opportunity to go back and start asking some of these questions, tying it to an actual event again. But others may have thoughts on how, a follow-up could be best structured, keeping in mind, again, we are not the ones who hold any power here, so we want to tread lightly.
Thank you, Michael.
So if there are no further reflections or comments or questions, then I suggest we can close the webinar for today. So that was really lovely. Thanks for attending all and contributing so actively. And we'll share the recording as well as the presentation post the call. And we look forward to welcoming you again next Wednesday on the third out of the 3 series of the webinar. So I hope you can all have soon a good weekend. Wish you all the best and talk soon. Bye now.